Chapter 8, Finishing Well. The final chapter of the Sacred Roots edition of John Woolman's journal covers the last year of John Woolman's life. It begins with his preparation for, and then a trip he actually does take to England. And with some discussions, he reflects on his journey all the way across. I'll get to that. Then after that, you have some of his reflections and accounts, usual kind of, I had this meeting with an individual or with a group, accounts of his trip in England to various different places. And he'll offer some reflections on things like horse-drawn carriages and silverware and things like that. And then he ends his journal with simply a reflection on an experience he had of God while he was sick. And then the journal ends, so to speak. But then at the end of the journal, the editors of the journal added a section of his last days that one of the editors wrote themselves, someone who has stayed with John Woolman into his death, recorded a bit of what John Woolman said and did in his last days. So that's the end of this chapter. Is that so? You've got these different pieces of chapter 8: his journey, his visit, his last days, all put together. I think there's any theme, though, that ties the chapter together. It's going back to the very beginning of the book, this life of integrity. Remember, in the beginning, the first chapter was called Choosing a Life of Integrity. And I think the thing to see with John Woolman is that he retained this integrity, this linking between belief and relationship and devotion and action all at the same time. And he does till the very end. He's talking about, and in the beginning, he talks about a bird and his care for the bird. And in the end, he talks about horses and his care for horses. You have this sense all the way through. Woolman wrote a few essays at the very end of his life. In the last few years, essays that you're not going to read, which I hope you will someday. And those essays are about things like integrity in life and about wisdom and about plain living and all of these kind of things. And what you find is he more and more and more expresses this burden of a life that is really fully lived, heart, mind, action together. He spoke boldly about the connection between our consumer habits and other people's sufferings. In the end, even his choices of what medical treatments to accept or reject, he died of smallpox and they were playing with different medications at that point in time. And even his choices of those medications themselves were made on the basis of his value system and his sense of what God would want. So really, really interesting to follow. And perhaps, I think this is one of the pastoral challenges that we face in that we can look at and gain out of this particular chapter. We are all going to die someday, and all of us who are leaders and pastors of others, we will be caring for people up to their death. We will usher them into the next life. And I think what we see, is how to accompany people. How do we help other people live an uncompromising life in Christ, in value systems, up until the very end? And by looking at how Woolman lived his last days, we begin to ask the question, how can we help others live into their days, their last days, fully present before God in terms of value systems and life and prayer and all of that together? One other thing I liked in this chapter, I really liked Woolman's discussion of his life with the sailors. He chose on his trip from the colonies to England, he chose on the trip not to be in the cabins, but to be down below, sleeping with the sailors. He wanted to get a feel for what it might have been like to be a slave living in the under part of the ship, and just wanted to identify with the working class, so to speak. But he got to know that in the trip, he got to know these young sailors personally. And he writes about his interactions with them and his care for the sailors. And I think it's in this moment, I mean, there's other places as well, but in this moment, you see a compassion, a personalness, a longing for salvation. I was thinking, in this section of the journal, we are graced with a portrait of John Woolman at his best. And so take note of that. I loved it, and maybe you will too.